This is FE Peer Review. The date is January the 3rd, 2022, going in great circles. This video I'm looking at two things actually. We will look at great circles, but before we look at that, we're going to look at mapping and map projections and how that works, because these two subjects fit quite well together. This video is about great circles and mapping. Map globe projections. I got the idea for it when I was listening to a conversation between Flat Out Hero and MCToon. Flat Out Hero, I'm kind of directing this video at you because there was some stuff in that conversation that I think didn't get quite sorted out entirely, and I thought I might be able to fill in some gaps. Don't know your name, so I'm just going to call you Hero, if you don't mind. Hero. Not a bad nickname. You and Toon were talking about this image on the screen. However, please ignore the red line. I have added the red line. The picture you were looking at looked just like this, but without the red line. So what we saw on this picture here, map of the United States, and we've got a black curve going across it. That curve is the Great Circle route between Los Angeles and New York. The shortest path along the surface of the earth between those two cities, and it's the path typically that airplanes fly. However, of course, if you were driving, you wouldn't be able to do that because there's no road that follows that path perfectly. You'd have to take one of the other lines you see on the screen here, the blue one or the gray one. But I think that point was clear enough. Now, what I think was not clear in the conversation was I got the impression you were saying to Toon, well, why not just go in a straight line from one city to the other? Why is the Great Circle path the shortest? And so I've added this red line on the screen. It's like if you could have whipped out a ruler and a red pen when you were having that conversation, I think this was the line you would have drawn on the screen there. And so I went into Photoshop and added that red line. And so the question is, why is that red line supposed to be longer than the black one? Well, we're going to look at that. And that's all about mapping. That's the big subject. So let's start by looking at this black line. Just ignore the red one for the moment. It starts at LA and it ends at New York. And at about the halfway point, roughly halfway, it crosses the border from Kansas to Missouri. I'm going to zoom in here. At the northeast corner of Kansas. That'll give us a reference point. And now what we're going to do is we're going to head over to Google Earth and we're going to look at that same path on Google Earth. So here we are in Google Earth, and I've had Google Earth create a path from LA to New York. And when you use the path command in Google Earth, it defaults to doing a Great Circle route. So this line is the same path that we saw in that other image. And you'll notice that we're at the border of Kansas and Missouri. It crosses over between those two states at the northeast corner of Kansas. So it matches that other image we saw. But this red line looks pretty darn near straight on this screen right now. Maybe not exactly straight, but a lot closer to straight than the other picture, than that black one. That black one's definitely curved. And our Google Earth image is definitely a lot closer to straight. So what's up with that? They pass through the same 3 points, and yet one looks straight and one looks curved. Well, let's compare the other path now. Let's go back and look at the other red line that I drew here. That was a straight line. And I noted some landmarks along the way, like it crosses Arizona to New Mexico right where the highway is. Then the northwest corner of Texas. I've found a few other spots like that. And I recreated that path in Google Earth. I started by dropping some pins at those landmarks. You saw those 4 pins I just put down. And then I just traced the path between those pins, connected the dots. And now that there looks very definitely curved. No, that is not a straight line. Whereas on this picture here, it was a straight line. So again, what's up with that? Why is it that they look different? Well, it's really very simple. Every flat map is going to have distortions in it. The Earth is a sphere, and when you try to flatten a sphere out, you can't keep the surface intact. It has to get distorted. You're going to either stretch it out or you're going to slice it. So that's the problem with mapping. You have to decide, you're going to stretch it or you're going to slice it. And if you're going to stretch it, where are you going to stretch it the most and where you're going to stretch it the least. So one way or the other, there's going to be distortions. And you just have to decide how you want to distort it. And how you want to distort it really depends a lot about what you want to do with your map. Because there's a lot of different reasons to make a map. So in short, the picture we're seeing here of the United States, this map of the United States, very simply, it's distorted differently than this picture on Google Earth. It's as simple as that. It's a different distortion. So a line that you draw on one of these is going to get distorted when you see that same line on the other one. Let's look at some map projections and see how they actually make them. First thing I suggest you do if you want to put a little time into this hero is to go to Wikipedia and look up the page called Map Projection. It's a nice page. They've got some good things here. They've got a lot of interesting diagrams showing all different kinds of projections. I'm going to scroll down to show you one in particular. This one here. You've got your Earth, which is a sphere, and then they've slipped a cylinder over it so that the cylinder touches the Earth right at the equator. And I'm going to go to another website that shows you what you do for the next step. Here on the left we've got our sphere with the cylinder over it. Now imagine that you've got a point at the center of that sphere and you're drawing a line from that central point through some particular landmark on the surface of the Earth, like Hudson Bay. And then you continue with that line until you reach the cylinder. And that is where you draw Hudson Bay on the cylinder. Then you do the same from the center of the Earth through Maine, and then where it hits the cylinder, that's where you draw Maine. Continuing down the next line, that's about equivalent to Cuba, and then we draw it on the cylinder. And finally you get to the equator, and the cylinder and the sphere actually touch. There's no distortion at all. So we see up here at this line, we see Hudson Bay up here. And then along here we see Maine. And then here we see Cuba. And then here's the equator. And now you take your cylinder and you decide where there's a good spot to make a slice, maybe right between Alaska and Russia. You make a slice through your cylinder right there, get your scissors out and cut it. And then when you've cut your cylinder, a cylinder you can easily flatten out. That goes flat no problem, not like a sphere. But we've introduced some distortion. So the distances near the equator, they're very accurate. They're almost perfect. You know, there's very little difference between the sphere and the cylinder when we're down here at the equator area. But the farther north we go, the farther south we go, the more we get things spread out. So the same on the flattened out version up here, the farther north we go, the farther south we go, the more things get spread out. So let's go back to our Wikipedia page here. We have that same diagram here with the cylinder and the Earth, and we see the cylinder touching the Earth at the equator, and we've got the map. Same map we were just looking at. I just wanted to show you the other one because I had that, showed how those lines were all projected to make it work. Well, they've got another one here. It's kind of interesting. Instead of slipping the cylinder over the sphere so it touches at the equator, this one they've done it so that it touches at the North Pole and the South Pole and on a longitude line. And then they slice it open and flatten it out. And you end up with a very different looking map of the Earth. We see it here on the right. The South Pole, Antarctica, is one of the points where the sphere and the cylinder are touching. So you get really good, accurate version of what Antarctica looks like. And also the same around the North Pole. That's very accurate, the way things look around the North Pole. But you get a lot of distortion in other parts of the sphere. So, like, well, in this case, they've actually sliced right through Africa in order to flatten out their sphere. They've sliced through Africa, so Africa's a total mess. And Brazil, South America is looking pretty strange too. We're going to look at one more website here. It's a company called Esri, and they do maps. They're maybe the biggest for maps, biggest in the world, I think. They do the maps you see on most of the websites that are out there. Like if you go to your city government website and it's got a map of the city, showing like where the sewer lines are, for example. That's probably Esri that made that map. So let's go over to Esri. They have animations showing how all different kinds of projections are done. And they've got that same cylinder over the sphere. And so they're going to start with the cylinder straight up and down, like we saw it, so that it touches the equator. That's what we see here. And then on the right, on the left, we see the map. And then they're going to gradually rotate that cylinder and show you how the map changes depending on how you place that cylinder. And once the cylinder is totally rotated, you'll see that Antarctica, which is down here, looks like a normal continent, but South America looks really weird. So we're getting there. We're about halfway. And we're about 2/3 of the way. Almost there. And then finally we reach the point where Antarctica's right, but South America is a big mess. So those are the different ways distortion comes into mapping, and you just have to decide what kind of distortion is okay for your situation. I'm going to show you a few more projections. I'm getting these off that same Wikipedia page that was on map projections. In each case, you can kind of imagine that you could take the piece of paper that they've projected it onto and fold the paper around and sort of turn it back into a sphere again. And you can see that it won't work perfectly because things are distorted, but you can get a feel for how you could almost kind of wrap that around and turn it back into a sphere. Gives you a pretty good, this projection is pretty good at getting the areas of the different continents correct compared to each other. But the longitude lines have got these big arcs in them, so the shapes aren't right. The area, like the area of Australia compared to the area of the United States, is pretty much accurate, but the shapes are not right. The profiles, the outlines aren't quite right. There's another version. Here's one where they could reduce the amount of distortion by slicing. So if you've got your orange peel, instead of stretching it, you're slicing it. And by introducing the slices, they didn't have to distort the rest of it as much. But of course that means that you no longer get a good sense for the shapes of the oceans because they've put all the slices into the ocean areas. And then of course poor Greenland up here got sliced in half. So there's another. Each one of these is just a different bit of math. And that brings me back to the point of distortion. You know, I call it distortion, but I'm not going to say that these maps are wrong. They're not wrong. They're not wrong because there's math behind it that tells us how much they're inaccurate. And if we know what the math is, we can adjust. We can compensate for that and actually get the correct information if we need it. Now, that's not generally something people bother to do just because you pick a map that's sort of your best map for your circumstances. But in theory, you certainly could. You could take this map and say, what's the distance between southern India and northern India? Well, I know that this map has this much distortion in this part of the map, so I'll measure it off the map and I'll compensate for that distortion and I'll get the correct number. So no, they're not wrong. They're distorted, but they're distorted with a system. And we know what the system is, so we can account for it. I think that's enough about mapping and distortion and projections. I want to move on to great circles. In this part, we're going to be talking about what a great circle is and why it's the shortest path on the surface of a sphere. I've created in the program SketchUp, which I use for doing my architecture work, I've created a sphere here. And for convenience, I've created a little object off to the right side, which is a cube with one corner cut off. It gives me a quick and easy way to create sections. And what we're going to do is cut some sections through this sphere. Now, SketchUp has a very convenient tool for cutting sections. It's what you use to make floor plans and building sections. And it very simply creates a flat plane, which you then can put on your object. And wherever that plane intersects your object, you get a section cut of the object. I'll show you how that looks on our cube off to the right here. Now the section plane automatically aligns itself with whatever face you touch there. So you can pick whichever face you want, whichever direction you want to be cutting this object. So I'll pick this side here. And then once I've made that section plane, I can shift it along that axis and figure out where I want to put it for whatever purpose I've got in mind. So that's how the section plane tool works. And I'm going to do one on the sphere over here. Get rid of this one first. I'm going to go over here to the sphere, and I'm going to do the same thing again, section plane. And I'm going to start by aligning it on that red face. And you can see that it's just touching the sphere right here. I'm going to move that section plane and watch what happens where it cuts where it's cutting the surface of the sphere. So wherever I put it on that sphere, the surface that's left, the surface that it shows us left over, we'll go over here a little better, is also a circle. The surface that's being cut away is a circle. No matter where I put that section plane, and I'm going to angle this section plane all different angles, and you'll see that it always gives us a circle. So that's one of the things about a sphere, is no matter how you cut it, if your cut's a straight surface, then you're going to get a circle. I'm going to do one at the funny angle that we see on the right on that triangle there. I'm going to do a new section plane, and I'm going to align it with that. Come over here. And again, it's a circle. Looks a bit like the Death Star from Star Wars. And I can move that, and it's still always a circle that's been cut off. So let's make 2 points on this sphere, and we'll pretend like they're Los Angeles and New York. I've made them. I've made a little marker, kind of an arrow, that points to the surface of the sphere, from the center of the sphere to the surface. I haven't tried to make it so that it's an exact match for Los Angeles and New York, but I just kind of put them randomly so that they didn't line up with other things really easily. And one of them is to the west and further south, that would be LA. The other one is further east and to the north, that'd be New York. And these little arrows, they point right to the surface of the sphere. They actually touch the surface of the sphere, and the arrows start at the center of the sphere. So I made these 2 arrows, and then I connected them with a straight line. And now this straight line is a literally straight line. It does not go on the surface of the sphere. It's inside the sphere. I'll rotate this around a little bit, and you can see that it stays straight no matter what angle we view it from. And if I can bring the globe around here, you'll kind of be able to see the way it sort of goes through. Also, it can come in here and look at it this way. And if I line up the 2 tips of the arrows where the surfaces, where those arrows touch the surface of the Earth, we see that the line connecting them is inside the Earth. So if you really wanted to create the shortest path between Los Angeles and New York, the shortest path would be a tunnel. You'd be digging, to make a dead straight line, you'd be digging and going underground and then coming out the other end of the tunnel at New York, and your tunnel would be perfectly straight. Now there's actually a building called LIGO in Hanford, Washington, which is a place where they do research and they shoot lasers and stuff, and they need to have this tube. It's like 2.5 miles long, and it's dead straight, and it's vacuum, and they shoot a laser up and down this tube or something. I don't know exactly what they do in there, but it has to be dead straight. It's not following the curve of the Earth. And Blue Marble Science, he did a video where he looked at the construction drawings. I don't know where he got them from, but he looked at the construction drawings for those tubes. And in order to build that thing straight, really straight, and not curving with the Earth, 2.5 miles long, they had to define levels. Now, level is normally defined with respect to the surface of the Earth. So it looks on the drawings like it looks like the levels are changing because the Earth is curving, but in fact, the tube is straight and the Earth is curving, and that's why the levels on the drawing change. It's quite an amazing little video, and I'll put a link to it in the description. But that's what they were doing there. They were effectively creating a straight line that ignored the surface of the Earth. Well, we're not doing that with our great circle from Los Angeles to New York. We want to find the shortest path on the surface of the sphere that connects to that. And that surface, that path, is a plane which passes through both of those points and the center of the Earth. There's probably a mathematical proof for that, and I wouldn't know how to do that proof because that's not my forte. But we could create a flat plane that cuts through our globe, like we were looking at those section planes before, but it cuts through it at Los Angeles, at New York, and at the center of the sphere. If we can create that plane, that gives us the great circle path connection, the great circle path between those 2 points. And I've made that plane here. I'll turn it on. There's our plane, and I'll rotate this around a bit. You can see that the plane passes right through the middle of the Earth. The circle of the center of the sphere is right there, where I've got the mouse. So you see that plane passes through the center, and it also passes through our Los Angeles and New York points. So where that plane intersects the surface of the sphere, right where I'm running the mouse, that is our great circle. And that there's only one plane that connects those 3 specific points, and it's the plane we're looking at. So any other connection will give you a longer distance, a longer path between those 2 lines. Here's another way you can do it. If you can get your hands on a desktop globe, a nice good globe that's at least 8 inches, maybe 10 or 12 inches in diameter, and get some extra large rubber bands or a piece of string, you can easily mark a great circle on a globe by taking the string and holding one end of the string at your starting point and then pulling the string tight and bringing the other end of the string over to your end point and just kind of like manipulating the string until there's no slack in it anymore. And the line that it makes across the surface of your globe is the shortest path, and that's also a great circle. So, Hero, I have a suggestion for you. If you want to research all of this a little bit more, I think sometimes the best way to learn something isn't just by listening to watching other people do it, but to actually do it yourself. So, we did a little exercise here today where I traced these 2 paths, the black line and the red line. I took them from this map, which you were looking at with MCToon, and I put them onto Google Earth. And I traced them onto Google Earth. Just the act of doing that forced me to look carefully, like where does the line cross each state border, and I really had to pay attention, and that helps you to really grasp the message. That's how you learn it, is by doing it that way. So what I wanted to suggest to you is to go to another Wikipedia page called List of Map Projections, and it's an incredible page. I mean, it's amazing how many different projections there are. And this is by no means all of them, but there are a lot of really interesting map projections here. What I think you might want to do is pick 3 or 4. Like, let's say, I'll grab this one here, Gall Stereographic. Let's take a look at that one. And take that image there. There's the United States. We've got Los Angeles down here, New York over there. Try to trace both of those lines, the black line and the red line, on this map projection and see what those lines end up looking like. Now, this is a different projection than the others, so there should be different distortion on them. Do that with 3 or 4 of these. Let's find one that's going to obviously be really distorted. Like, let's take this sinusoidal one here. get a load of that. You've got New York up here and LA down there. You're going to have a really crazy looking pair of paths. I think the act of actually drawing these lines, print them out on a piece of paper and actually draw them on the piece of paper. And I think that just the practice of doing that will be really worthwhile in understanding just how much these projections differ from each other and what that means in terms of mapping and the difficulties of mapping the globe. You know, if you get a really good quality map that covers a large area, like some of the stuff produced by National Geographic or maybe AAA still does it with their maps. It's been a while since I've checked theirs. You'll see often on the edge of the map, along the sides of the map, that they might show the longitude line, and you'll see that it's not parallel on both edges of the map, that it's slightly narrower at the top than it is at the bottom for the United States, for American maps. It's stuff like that that makes you realize maps aren't all they seem to be at first glance. Let's look at one more thing here. Let's take a look at the border of Iowa and Minnesota. I did a video about this. I'll put a link in the description. Back when Thomas Jefferson was president, interesting bit of American history, you know, that was when we had the Louisiana Purchase, and suddenly the United States became much, much bigger than it was before. And Congress and the president decided we needed to develop a system for surveying all of the land and defining where all the boundaries were going to be. Because they knew there were going to be people settling all that land, and there's going to be farms and cities. So they came up with an idea to draw a grid over the entire country, create a grid over the entire country that could be used for that purpose. And they called it Townships and Sections. I'm going from memory here. I think a township is 6 miles by 6 miles. It's a square, 6 miles by 6 miles. And then a section is a square that's 1 mile by 1 mile, and there's 36 of those inside one township. And then the sections get subdivided further, and so forth and so on until you get down to individual farmers' fields. So if you zoom in slowly on Google Earth here into this northern Iowa, southern Minnesota area here, which is really, really flat, you start to see a grid show up in the countryside. And that grid, those are 1 mile squares. Those are sections. And if you look closely, you'll start to find townships as well, where there'll be a bigger road. And everything is aligned north, south, east, west. Now you can see the squares really well. So that's all fine, and I'm going to grab the ruler here and measure one of these. Get it set to miles. Okay. Let's measure one of these squares here. Let's take this square right here. That's a mile. And that's a mile. So there's your 1 mile square. Now, everything's fine with that grid, except there's one problem. You can't take a piece of grid paper and wrap it around a globe without the paper wrinkling. So they knew they were going to have this problem because they knew exactly what the Earth was back then. They knew it was a globe. And they had a pretty good idea how big of a globe it was too. So they knew that there were going to be wrinkles in their grid, and they had to decide where to put the wrinkles. The major problem is that the farther north you go, take two roads that are a mile apart going north-south, they're going to get closer and closer together as you go up. So they had to decide every so often to make an adjustment. And they usually made it at a logical place like a boundary between two counties or boundary between two states. So we're here in northern Iowa, and we're gradually moving up towards Minnesota. And let's take a couple of these roads here. Let's take some of these north-south roads on the screen here. And every mile we're crossing an east-west road, and the grid continues and everything is fine and smooth. And then we get up to here, and you see this gray line? That's the border between Iowa and Minnesota. And that's where they decided to make an adjustment. So you've got suddenly your north-south road, there's a jog in it before it continues up. And here comes another road with a jog, and another with a jog, and here as well. Now they've made it a little bit curved because they wanted a higher turning radius for that. But you see, if you go across here, you see those roads all have a bit of a jog in them. But there's something else to notice too. The jogs, as I'm panning across here, those jogs are getting smaller and smaller because every so often the roads will line up. So here they're pretty close to lining up. It looks like it might be right about here where they actually line up. So they kept this one going all the way through, and then they adjusted in one direction on the east side and in another direction on the west side. These jogs in these roads, if you study them, you'll see that that's how they managed to keep this 1 square mile grid pretty consistent all the way up, while still managing to work in the curvature of the Earth. Now, obviously, there are places where there are other problems, like they run into a lake or a river or something like that, and so they decide to break the grid for those things. But you'll find in the large flat areas, like here in Iowa and Minnesota, that the globe Earth and surveying on a flat surface were like right there at the start of the history of our country problem we had to face. And we fixed it. You know, Thomas Jefferson and his team, they were smart people. They knew what they were doing. They did a pretty good job. So there you go. Bit of American history too. I did a video on that. I'll put a link in the description. I hope this is useful to you. I hope you enjoyed it. And leave a comment. Let's talk about it. Hero and everyone else. Anyone else who's interested. Bye now. Have a great day.